Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. Today on the show, we are talking economics and world development.
Our guest is Kate Raworth, who invented a couple years ago a concept called donut economics, which allows us to consider more than just markets when it comes to the way that the world grows financially and socially. And so basically, the idea is that there is a place in which human development is solid and functional. And that place is defined by the elevation of those in poverty so that they have healthcare, they have housing, they have employment, they are able to actually take care of themselves.
Opportunity.
They have opportunity, but that their opportunity is not so massively consumptive that it escapes what are called the planetary boundaries. And so you have these 9 planetary boundaries that have to do with biodiversity, ocean acidification, carbon, what others? Clean air, like basically all of these foundational things that you need in order to have a planet where you can thrive as opposed to just live in a cratered minefield because the ground has been destroyed by strip mining or logging or whatever else. And so it's this balance, getting people out of poverty, but getting them out of poverty in such a way that they don't overshoot the material basis of the planet on which we live, where we have limited resources.
Yeah, in general, I think the overall thesis is how to create an economic workflow that is humane, as opposed to one that just makes rich people richer and keeps poor people poor, or maybe gives them some crumbs from the top. There must be some way to integrate our human needs into this entire financial economic structure that isn't just based on dollars in, dollars out, because that misses a lot of the story. And we've talked about this with Michael Hudson before, obviously, that, GDP is a really crummy marker for how well a country is doing because it doesn't factor in how much debt people are in, how little they actually own, how much they're giving away to landlords and to financial institutions, right? You can have all of this apparent growth on the surface and just utter deprivation below the surface. So,
speaking of dollars in and dollars out, if you like the Demystify Sci podcast, consider coming over to patreon.com. We are asking for your support because it prevents us from having to sell stuff. As you will probably discover if you listen to this conversation, I think that this rampant consumerism where people are just accumulating goods isn't good for the planet. I think it's not good for the people that are participating in it, and I don't think that it's good for the societies that we live in to be driven solely by the exchange of tchotchkes.
And the height of art, if you go back to the Renaissance, it was entirely patron supported, right? The idea that you can actually fund the kind of creative works that you want to see in the world directly has never been easier. You can scrape off the tiniest little crumbs from your paycheck, a couple dollars a month, and all of that adds up. And that's how we're able to do this program. We have dozens upon dozens of patrons who are giving us the tiniest amount, but it's adding up to something that gives us the time and resources to make this happen, to put out 2 of these episodes every week, which actually isn't a little bit of work at all. And so please come over to our community. You can hang out with us every Sunday. We get together and do a big Zoom chat and talk about where this program should be going in the future, what guests we should be talking to, what ideas are important and exciting in the world, and we'd love to see you there.
Patreon.com/demystifysci, and we hope to see you there, as Shilo said. And in the meantime, enjoy our conversation with Kate Raworth, and we will see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I feel like a lot of people think of economists as people who are obsessed with money and they're almost in the financial motivation sphere. But a lot of people don't realize that, Adam Smith was primarily a moral philosopher in the first place, right? And so I think there is a road to this that has nothing to do really with markets and so forth as a motivation, right? In terms of, becoming an expert hedge fund manager or something like that.
I absolutely agree. And actually, so the idea of studying economics and philosophy and politics together is a really good one because economics has profound political assumptions and implications and is underpinned by a moral philosophy. The problem in practice is that the three are actually taught, in my experience, not at all taught together. They're taught almost in siloed ways, and economics is such a self-contained discipline now. We didn't continually examine the ethical and political underpinnings of the economic theory, so you had to keep trying to bring that in yourself. But I agree, it should be. I never had an interest. I didn't go into it thinking, oh, I want to go and make money. And I think actually, in my experience in economics degrees, you get at least two big groups of people together, maybe three. Okay. You get those who I want to learn this language because I want to join that club. I want to be able to talk economics so I can go into business, I can go into trading, I can go into markets. You get people who want to go into public policy. And then I think you get people who, to put it simplistically, but truly, they want to change the world. They want the tools. And so they're all sitting alongside each other in lectures with very different interests, actually, and very different ambitions for what this material should be covering. And there comes a question of, well, who will be served? Whose interests will be served by the frameworks that are taught in this degree? And what I find is most universities in the world, I think it's focused towards, I want to learn and master this language and enter this club. And the policymaker, how would you tweak policies? And I think we need to really reframe economics education, because more and more students realize that what they are being taught is in no way equipping them for the realities of today, for the challenges ahead, if they're going to be the policymakers, the business leaders, the MPs and prime ministers, the lawyers, the journalists of 2050. The frameworks they're being taught today don't teach them to understand the contemporary economy, let alone transform it.
And did you get the sense of that immediately upon starting to investigate this question of what is a good measure of human development?
So I certainly didn't get it as soon as I started studying economics. I had a kind of environmental leaning. There was no paper at all available in environmental economics, for example, let alone ecological economics. You just couldn't study it. So you could study public economics, and we spent 1 week learning about, environmental pollution, the classic case of there's a company that's dumping gloop in the river. How would you tackle it, with a tax or with a quota? That was it. That was the entire kind of environmental content of my degree. And that's because I chose to study public economics. I could have done a whole degree where Earth, life, the planet, living systems were never mentioned. And I could have got a first class degree without ever thinking about the connection between the economy and the planet. I hope that is no longer possible, but I didn't realize it at first. It took me a while because I was on that catch up. I needed to catch up with everybody who already done the A level, the high school diploma. And it took me a while to start getting frustrated with the assumptions that were written into when we did welfare economics. You take initial income distribution as given. And I thought, well, why would you do that? We should start with a human rights framing that every person has a claim to their essential needs in life. Why do we just start with initial distribution is given? Where is the living world? I was very frustrated by the naming and the framing that comes in economics. So if we want to talk about acid rain, very 1980s, if we want to talk about the hole in the ozone layer, or damage to the planet today, climate breakdown, ecological breakdown, if you want to talk about any of that, economists say, yes, we have a term for that. It's an environmental externality. And I just became really dissatisfied with the idea that these were environmental externalities. External to what? They're external to market contracts. So their very naming tells you what's at the center. It's the market contract. And I, over the years of studying mainstream economics, I more and more never wanted to say, hello, I'm an economist. It just didn't feel something I was going to be proud of. And the more I started to study development economics with this professor who gave me this question about human development, once I landed in development economics, which did start with human development and human needs and capabilities and the work of Amartya Sen, it just made sense. And I thought, why is this development economics? Why isn't this just all economics? Why do we actually put philosophy and politics into our economics when we're talking about those low-income developing countries over there? Why don't we talk about this when we talk about our own nation? So I moved over to development economics, and I did a master's degree in development economics. But I got more and more frustrated by the narrow realm of what was counted as economics once I gradually realized there was sociology, there was anthropology, there was development studies, there was more political ways of understanding, but that was all cut out of what we were doing. And so I felt trapped and didn't want to be called an economist. I never called myself an economist. It took me decades to choose to come back towards it and say, I'll be a renegade economist because I want to be part of the team that rewrites this.
And so why do you think that we spend so much time talking about development in these other countries and not in the, the developed quote unquote world?
Yeah, not developed. The global north, let's call it, or the high income countries.
Sure.
I mean, I think the politics and the philosophy came in because actually a much wider minded group of people started writing development economic theory. Scholars who were drawn to this saw the politics of the global north and south, even though we didn't call it that in the 1980s, saw the politics of globalization. They brought in the richness of other disciplines, which is, of course, what always should be informing economics. Whereas it had been, I think, chased out in mainstream economics, which has become heavily mathematized. So today, I think if you want to go to university and study economics, you better be good at math. Well, I think you should be good at moral philosophy. I think you should be good at understanding the earth. Because economics, let's go back to this word, economics is made up of two words from ancient Greek, ekos nomos. It means the art of household management. Oh, I'm an economist, really? You're somebody seeking to master the art of household management. You had better know and understand this household. And today it's not just the level of a nation, as Adam Smith focused on, the wealth of nations. It's the planetary household, because we recognize we are profoundly interconnected. We have the data, we have the globalization, we have the global interconnections that tell us so.
Is that the same root as ecology and so forth?
Yes, ecos, the household.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's so obvious,
So
like sitting in
ecology-
plain sight, but yeah.
Right, exactly. For all of us, right? So ecology means knowledge of the household, and economics means the management of the household. So it's just beautiful. Thank you for pointing that out. Economists learn nothing of ecology. They learn nothing of the knowledge of the planetary household. We do not start with Earth system science. We should learn about the carbon cycle, the water cycle. We should learn about ecosystems. We should learn about planetary boundaries. If you want to manage this household, you darn well should understand how it functions when it's healthy and where its limit pressures are. And by the way, you're managing it in the interest of all of its inhabitants. So you should know about its people and its creatures, and you should think in terms of their rights. So actually, economics, if we go to its root, I think it starts with Earth system science. It starts with human rights. And only then do we invite in the question of what kind of institutions and structures, be they markets, be they the commons, be they the state, what kind of incentives and regulations would we put in place in our human construct that we call the economy to actually manage this household well in the interest of her inhabitants? That is essentially, in a fairly academically stated way, the heart of donut economics, because the donut starts by saying, what are the interests and needs of all people? What is the health of the whole planet? We need to create an economy that meets the needs of all people within the means of the living world. It looks like a donut. I could show you.
Sure.
Here it is.
I love it.
Here's the donut. So if you think of humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of this picture, then this hole in the middle, that's a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life. It's where people do not have the resources they each need as a human right for health, education, water, food, energy, housing, income. These are drawn from the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I drew them from the SDGs is because it means that all the governments in all the world have already recognized that every person in the world has a claim not to live in this hole. So leave no one in the hole. But as we collectively use Earth resources, we want to get everybody over this social foundation into the green ring. But there's a very 21st century other side to that story. We now know, thanks to Earth system science, that if we collectively use Earth's resources, convert them, transform them to such an extent, we risk going beyond this ecological ceiling where we push ourselves beyond the life support systems of our planetary home. These are the 9 planetary boundaries around the edge, recognized in 2009 by Earth system scientists. And they said these are the what we believe are the safe boundaries, like a precautionary principle, safety zone beyond which we should not go if we want to sustain a stable climate and fertile soils and healthy oceans and abundant biodiversity and recharging fresh water and a protective ozone layer overhead. So we want to live in the donut-shaped space in between this social foundation and the ecological ceiling. We want to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And I first drew this diagram in 2011 in response to the diagram of planetary boundaries. It rocked my world. I had this massive adrenaline rush when I saw the planetary boundary diagram, the outside. And I thought, if that's an ecological outside, I'm going to bring a social justice inside, a minimum claim of resources for all people. It's not a circle now, it's a donut. And if that's the goal, right, let's start economics with a goal. Let's be explicit about what we're for. And we can debate that, but great, now we're at least having a debate and we're being explicit. What are we for? We're for this goal, then what kind of economy would take us there? That's the heart of donut economics.
I love that.
Yeah, it's an interesting addition here because we spoke with Catherine Richardson last year, who
Right.
educated us all about the boundaries side of things. But this interior space is interesting. So it might be interesting to steelman the opposition to this a little bit, which is this background idea that the free market, if you completely unhinge the markets, that they'll take care of themselves and lift up the people at the lowest rungs in that interior. Is that a fair steelman of the free market position? Which I guess, is that the opposition to this primarily?
Well, the market, the free market view would be sort of, look, markets are the most effective instrument that humans have created for transferring signals of production and wants, needs and wants. And so let them rip. Markets, let me put the free market view. Okay, markets are going to be far more effective than governments, which might be corrupt or might have inadequate information or might have long delays. So just let the market and optimize conditions. And if where there is no market, create a market. And then people will be able to signal their wants and their willingness to supply and be able to exchange between them to collectively meet their needs and wants. It's a wonderful idea, right? So that would be
and I guess in
view.
support of it would be the idea that interior space has shrunk in the last century or so, right? That people are in less poverty than ever before and so forth. The question, I guess, becomes how free are the market? Have we ever actually achieved a free market? Has that ever even been a thing, or has it always been tightly managed in service of enlarging the interior of that donut?
Well, on that, I don't think there is. I mean, having just tried to make the free market case,
yeah,
the utopia of markets everywhere. I mean, I just don't think it makes sense to say free market. There's no such thing as a free market. All markets have been regulated. There are things you are and are not allowed to buy and sell. You're not allowed to buy and sell people or children's labor.
Not for a while, anyways.
Legal, right? You're not supposed to buy and sell passports or guns. Regulated. So there's regulation, there are conditions, and in fact, markets are strongly shaped by contracts, terms of contracts about working hours and working conditions, and who will benefit if the company collapses. There's strong contracts, and there's armies of lawyers regulating around this in the interest of business or in the interest of government, in the interest of the public good. Markets are highly designed spaces within which the idea is, within the design of that space, the price mechanism should be allowed to determine outcomes. And markets are a valuable construct. I would not want to live in a society that didn't have the market mechanism at all. But I really wouldn't want to live in a society that had only the market mechanism, because markets are really powerful, right? Adam Smith wrote about the power of the market in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. They are a brilliant way, in many ways, of coordinating the needs and wants of millions of people who may never meet and never need to meet, because what I'm wanting to buy and what you're ready to sell is transmitted through the price mechanism, and we can buy and sell through supply chains. So it's a very effective feedback loop in many ways. I'm making the strongest market case I can. There are some caveats. There are some big caveats. Markets only serve people who can pay. And this is taking me right back to my wanting to start economics with human rights. Well, there are billions of people in the world who can't pay for food and clean water and healthcare and education because they live in poverty because of the systems in which we're structured. So they do not have the capacity to pay. Markets totally fail them. And markets tend to value what's priced, and everything else they tend to exploit. So we can't, a world that was just saying, let the market rip, is going to be a world that utterly serves the world's billionaires. It would have all of us producing everything for the world's billionaires and totally neglecting the needs, public interests and the needs of the worst off. And it would have us exploiting the rest of the world if there was no regulation protecting household, protecting care time in the home, protecting the living world, protecting nature, protecting communities. The market would just extract from everything. It does a pretty good job of that, because I think the regulations in place to bound it are not nearly strong enough. There is a market fundamentalism, and we need to swing back.
Yeah, that makes sense. I made the case earlier. I think it's pretty clear that we've really lifted a lot of the world out of complete poverty in the last 100 years. Do you think there's a case to be made that regulatory action on the economy is in some part responsible for that?
So over the last 100 years, many people have indeed seen their incomes rise and come out of life in poverty. But there are billions of people who still, in a world that's never been as rich as it is right now, financially, in countries that have never, I'm in the UK. Where are you both today?
We're on the west coast of the United States.
Okay, you're right. The UK, the US, here we are in two of the richest countries in the history of humankind. And yet your country and mine have shocking levels of poverty, of people who live in utter poverty in the midst of plenty. So sheer increase in income is not what does that. But here's, the donut itself. I showed you the donut as a concept, but here's data on the donut. The planetary boundaries, you were talking to Catherine Richardson, right? They've done a recent update on planetary boundaries. It's worse than this. I haven't updated the donut. Think of more red here. But the inside, this is the extent of poverty in the world today. Billions of people are still falling short on their very most basic needs of not having enough food to eat, not having access to healthcare, not getting their kids through school. And actually, just going back to philosophy, so the donut intentionally is a Rawlsian construct in that here we focus on those living in deprivation. It's not an average measure. We're not trying to show how already well off people are. We focus on those who are living below an unacceptably low social foundation. And the goal here is to eliminate all of the red, leave nobody left in this space of poverty. The kicker is that we have to do that at the same time as coming back within planetary boundaries. And 20th century economists didn't even think about that because they didn't see planetary boundaries. They could make a fairly robust assumption. Think US and Europe post-war. There was quite a strong correlation between rising national income and growing incomes. In a labor-intensive industrial economy, rising national income means more jobs, means more income for the workers, taking home money to their families, more public revenue. You can start moving people out of poverty just by pursuing growth. In the 21st century, we know too much. We know that at the same time as growth giving incomes to households, it's pushed us well over planetary boundaries. So for me, this image actually tells us that it's just a really nice reminder that last century's economic theory is not going to turn this around, because it was never designed for this. It didn't see this challenge. Last century's business models, last century's government policies, last century's market regulation, none of it was designed for this challenge. We need to recognize that this is our selfie of humanity in the living world. And we need to redesign from our theories all the way through our practice if we're going to actually turn this around, come into the donut from both sides at the same time. That's not been done before.
And in the past, the way that I feel like people have approached the inside of the donut has been to just speak of overpopulation and needing to introduce birth control to these countries to slow down growth. And that has always seemed to me as a really inhumane and kind of horrifying approach. Like if you look at Paul Ehrlich's Limits to Growth.
Population bomb.
Limits to Growth was the Club of Rome. Mm-hmm. You read the population bomb and it chills you to the bone. There's this specific passage where he's talking about pending starvation in India and saying that we shouldn't offer them any food aid unless they implement severe birth control policies. And he proposes that even if they don't agree, that we should just start putting birth control in the water. And this kind of mentality, to me, seems horrifyingly paternalistic, but super common in the last century. And so oh, go ahead.
Go on.
Well, I still see currents of this sometimes. You talk to people and they're like, there's just too many people in the world and we need to have fewer people. And that seems like a really catastrophic policy choice, because every time that anybody's tried that, it has had horrific consequences. You think about the single child policy in China.
Not to mention it's already happening naturally, right?
It's happening in the global north, which...
But I think if you look at projections, right, for the next 100 years or so, it seems like it will level off. I mean, the developed world's populations are actually on the path to decline, right?
Sure, but I think that the worry has never been that there's going to be too many people born in Switzerland. The worry is always tinged with this fear of what will happen in the global south when there's all these people. And I still see people talking about overpopulation. We run across this all the time.
Yeah, it's very, very common.
And how does that fit into donut economics?
Great question. And in fact, often when I present the donut, it hasn't happened for a while, but it used to happen quite a lot. When I would present the donut, there would be an older white man, often from biology or natural sciences, who'd put his hand up very angry at the front and say, why haven't you put population in the donut? And it like this. So, and the question always comes up straight away. So I always would just address it because I think it's really important to talk about it. It's really important to talk about it. So first of all, I want to say The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, right? I think it was written in 1969. Even that word bomb is explosion. So he's telling us that this is an explosive trend. Let me get my hose pipe for a bit of a graph. Ehrlich is telling us this is what's happening to global population. It is exploding. And actually, looking back, he wrote that book at the point in time when, in fact, global population growth was at its most steep rate. It looked as if it was exponential. Before I go on, I want to say, with Ehrlich writing those kinds of, here am I, white male, privileged white male in the global north, saying what should happen about those people there. No wonder a more diverse group and a more politicized group of people came into development economics, right? And said, well, thank you very much. We'll write an economics from our own perspective. I think it's also really important. Any one of us could, if we could go back and ask our great grandparents, how many brothers and sisters did you have? You'd probably say 7, 5, right? And so our own nations have been through that massive population transition, that demographic transition. So just to talk about that, Ehrlich thought population was explosive. As biologists, as any ecologist or biologist or epidemiologist will tell you, well, that's not what nature does. Nature doesn't explode the population, because what happens in nature is this S-curve, right? Things grow, and then something happens in the environment or in the population that they grow up and they flatten off. And of course, that
stationary
is exactly
phase. Yep.
Exactly. So it's a transitionary phase, and the human population is precisely going through this transition. We can see it in the data, and every country where the number of children that a woman has falls from 7 till 2 is adding to this stabilization of the population. So that's happening, and so population isn't the graph that keeps me awake at night. But before I say which one does, it also, I think it matters. It does matter how many people we are. For sure, it matters. Like whether this stabilizes at 15 billion or 12 billion or 10 billion or 8 billion. Because if we do want to leave nobody in the hole in the donut, nobody falling short on food, water, housing, energy, education, healthcare, transport, it takes resources. So there's a literal material relationship between provisioning for people's needs and the Earth's capacity. But it's never just about population. If anybody ever goes population, I'll go inequality, right? So as one person said, it's like you're talking about two sides of a square. You cannot talk to me just about population, sheer numbers, if you're not going to talk to me about distribution between people. And once we look at the distributional question of who's putting pressure on the planet, well, no surprises. It's a global 1%, but it's predominant those in the global north. The global minority of countries of very high income. So the graph that So I think it's really important that we do stabilize populations. But what's the best known way for doing that? It's not horrifically tampering with anybody's water. The best known way that empowers women to choose to have fewer children is child survival, right? If a mother knows her child's actually going to survive beyond the age of 5, it's women's education, girls' education, it's women's opportunity, it's women's access to healthcare and reproductive health. When those things are in place, women choose to have smaller families. And so in fact, getting people out of the hole in the donut is, I think, the way to empower people to choose to have a smaller family. And so they go together. The curve that keeps me awake at night is not population, because it's got, and as any natural system has, it's got this inbuilt tendency to flatten off. The curve that keeps me awake is the one system we've created that has no tendency to flatten off, which is the design of finance, which has absolutely no intention of flattening off. And we see it at the level of GDP growth in a nation. So governments want, you and I in the richest countries in the world, and here we are, our governments are saying, grow, grow, grow. The solutions to our problems lie in yet more growth. And at the level of every company, at the level of every investor, this is the desired shape of the curve. And to me, that is a curve that does not belong on a delicately balanced living planet. So that's the one that keeps me awake at night.
Yeah, it's come to our attention that this idea of GDP and growth doesn't necessarily factor in how well people are doing, right? Because, there's a lot of, what would you say?
Rentier.
Yeah, rentier class income, right? There's people.
Been talking to Michael Hudson.
We have been quite a bit, actually, of course. But yeah, I mean, that basic idea that GDP doesn't really price what's actually happening on the street, right? People can be going into debt, getting ostensibly locked down into whatever miserable situation they're in, but the GDP can be going up. And so it's not even a really good marker for actual financial growth of the population as a whole.
Or well-being, right? It's not a great market. Yeah, so GDP, I think over certain tracts of time, thinking about a country like Malawi, which has $1,700 on average per person. I mean, and huge levels of poverty. If a low-income country is to see its GDP double, and if that GDP doubles and is invested in the public good, if it has a government that actually has a public good focus, that can be massive. That incremental increase. Children do survive, families do eat well, kids go to school, people can build houses, they can have an income, they can live with dignity and build a better life. You see very strong relationship between increasing income and increasing well-being in life expectancy and education, but also self-reported well-being. But as it gets higher and higher, I think it's over around $15,000 per person, that relationship starts to flatten out. It's not so clear, partly because of inequalities, because of course GDP per capita is just an average. It's not telling you the actual distribution within a country, but also partly because more money actually isn't necessarily, the capacity to purchase more doesn't necessarily make us happier. Bigger house, more cars, more distant holidays. And the consumerism that got locked into 20th century psychology, the consumer propaganda, means that we are taught to continually chase things, buy things that can never ultimately satisfy what you want. You're always drawn back. So we can end up with very high spending patterns and not equivalently higher self-reported well-being. So many people would argue that the relationship between increased GDP breaks down if you care ultimately about well-being. And it certainly breaks down if you recognize that currently pursuing higher income is just tied to higher energy use and material footprint, and therefore impact on the living world, which ultimately sustains all life.
There was, have you seen Century of the Self?
Yes.
So that it's an incredible documentary. Adam Curtis, who is a BBC reporter. I mean, all of his documentaries are fantastic. Century of the Self is probably the one that's the deepest. I think it's like 8 hours long. And it really amazed me, the case that he made about this transition in the early 1900s towards this psychological consumerism, where the idea was that you could buy a version of yourself that was defined through these external goods. And to me, it seems like that's almost an inevitable transition as a country becomes richer and richer, that the markets suddenly realize that, oh, people have this disposable income and we can sell them an identity. And so this is the natural course of progression where you almost have to go through this period of conspicuous consumption before people start to react against it. Do you think that it's possible for the global south countries to entirely avoid that? Or is that just something that is best to push people through as quickly as possible? Because there's another book that I read, More from Less, which was
Less is more?
no, not less is more. That's the thing, because you had you moderated that debate
With Jason Hickel and Sam.
Yeah, exactly. More from Less. Yeah, exactly. So More from Less. It was by I don't know how I can't, but Andrew McAfee. And Andrew McAfee wrote this book basically making the case that the more developed we become, the more efficient our systems become. And so the answer to all of the crises of the modern age is to just accelerate development as quickly as possible to get people through this rocky intermediary point where there's maybe not the best incentives at play. And then when they get out the other side, all of a sudden you can look back on the things that you've been through, make the adjustments, and then progress in a more efficient way. And so I guess the question in this long ramble is, do you think that conspicuous consumption is something that can be avoided as countries become developed? Or do you think that that's just baked into the psychology of the interaction between people and markets and capitalism?
Great question. And I want to go a long way around about answering it. So John Maynard Keynes wrote a beautiful essay in, I think, 1930 or 31 called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. So Keynes was, of course, the most revered economist of the 20th century. His insights and his theories really transformed many economies. And so he was highly respected. But he wrote this very poetic essay, short and sweet. I highly recommend reading it. And in it, he said, well, one day the economic problem will be solved. I will move away from pursuing more and more income because people have limited needs and then they have wants. And he said, one day our needs will be satisfied. And what he completely didn't see was what's going to happen to our wants. And it was Veblen who had already said, hey, people, watch out, conspicuous consumption, where what we're actually needing there is not the jacket, the bag, the car. I'm needing somebody's respect, their attention, their admiration. And it was, as shown in The Century of the Self by Adam Curtis, it was Edward Bernays, who was fascinatingly the nephew of Sigmund Freud. I think he took his uncle's psychotherapy, right? Freud saw that we all wanted to be loved and admired. And his nephew thought, if I can just attach this coat to that sense of being admired, this car to being envied, then you get consumerism where people need to buy the next thing to belong. And that's the heart of conspicuous consumption. So your question is, is it inevitable? And we should kind of rush through it and just, okay, let's just get this over and done with, folks. Like, every teenager should go through a punk phase. You're making me think like, just do it, guys. Just go out, get piercing, just go through punk and, just come out the other side. Or is it not inevitable? And I don't think the motive behind conspicuous consumption comes from something innate to humans. It was actually very actively invented by major department stores in the 19th century, because once a company, so let's just go to the roots of what a company is trying to do. If a company's focus is on maximizing profit, I mean, they've sold you a coat. Damn, now you've got a coat. Now you don't need anything more from me. Oh, let's have 4 seasons. Let's have a winter coat, a spring coat, a summer coat, and an autumn coat. So they had the seasons, and then shops went to kind of like, every month. And now you get in really fast fashion chains like Zara, it's every week. We want you to come shopping every week. It is your leisure activity, surely, to come shopping. And every week you will encounter new things. And when it's gone, it's gone. So this feeling of FOMO, you'll miss out if you don't come in this weekend. So there is a psychology that is actually created in us by the marketing, by the techniques of the shops to drive their sales. So I think rather than trying to say we just got to live with kind of human consumerism and we've got to go through that phase and who knows when we'll come out the other side of it, it's actually the deep design of enterprise that's bent upon figuring out new ways to sell us stuff. That was consumer capitalism, and then they move on, and then you have sort of digital capitalism and financial capitalism, surveillance capitalism. It's just continually reinventing how else can we now capture value from people and turn it into profit. So I don't go along with the idea that we have to all go through that. And then at the national level, macro, if Andrew McAfee's making the argument, if I understand correctly, and what you just described is what's known as the environmental Kuznets curve, which says as nations get richer, initially pollution will go up, environmental footprint will go. But don't worry, folks, as they get even richer, it will come down. Well, first of all, that may be true for local pollutants like air and water. The richest countries in the world often have really clean water and clean air because they've exported the manufacturing is happening somewhere else, or their carbon emissions are affecting the whole world. When we take into account not just domestic production, but actually global pollutants like carbon emissions, like your global consumption footprint, this thing actually doesn't go down. Carbon emissions is kind of doing this and not coming down anything nearly fast enough. And global material footprints are still pretty strongly coupled with GDP increases. So even if there was this mountain, this is a mountain that's too high to climb. The world can't afford to have every nation over consuming Earth's resources. We will massively, irreversibly overshoot planetary boundaries. So we have to find a different way. We have to tap into that deeper sense of well-being, which actually doesn't need us all to be punk consumers. We can't all go through that. And I think in those of us in the global north also need a very deep letting go of what we've come to be told and come to believe is a normal level of consumer through flow, like the waste that we produce. It's been written into our economics because it values what's priced and it exploits what's not. And the degradation of the living world, the overshoot of planetary boundaries is currently missing from that and at the huge cost to Earth.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like the walking back on that is the real challenge. We sat down yesterday with Warren Mosler, I believe. He's a really interesting dude, and he has really outrageous things to say about almost everything. But one of the points he made that was an interesting little thought experiment was he said, during the pandemic, for the first time, you could actually see China through the smog, and he was trying to make the point that we actually did lower all of these emissions for a few minutes, essentially, geologically speaking. But we didn't ease back into things afterwards. We were just like, okay, let's get back at it afterwards. And everything kind of just went back to its status quo. So his point was more like, we actually know how to fix this. We can actually fix it, right? But the ability to actually choose that action path globally is beyond reach, essentially. People don't want to do it.
Well, and I think part of the reason that people don't want to do it is because everyone is complicit in the financial markets. Because the financial markets are structured in such a way that you have a company, like I think Zara is a great example, and the fashion industry in general, where you have 4 seasons a year, then you have 12 months a year, now you have weekly seasons, and the motivation behind that has to be that you have shareholders to which you are beholden, and the shareholders will only maintain ownership of your stock as long as the stock keeps rising. And so the entire system of rebooting production and manufacturing is deeply rooted in the fact that every single corporation on Earth cannot stop producing things, because if they do, their stock prices will suffer. And also the portfolio of every single person that's bought in will also suffer.
Which is pretty much everyone with a retirement plan or whatever.
I feel like in the global north, there's no one who's not... obviously there are people who aren't involved in the markets, but the vast majority of people have some involvement in them. And so they have some conflicting interest, because they might want to help the planet and they might want to take care of the ecological problems that are arising in the planetary boundaries, but then there's the retirement fund.
Yeah, their index funds don't go along with that plan.
Yeah, and so how do you how do you adjust for that? How do you take this obvious solution, which is that we just need to make less stuff and we need to deal with this paradoxical imperative of growth on a limited planet when it's so tied into people's financial well-being over the course of their entire lives?
So you've hit on what I think is the deepest challenge. We have economies that need to grow, whether or not that makes us thrive. And what we need are economies that enable us to thrive, whether or not they grow. For me, that's the ultimate challenge. And I left it to the end of my book because I wanted to focus on becoming regenerative by design, the dynamics we should be for, from degenerative to regenerative, from divisive to distributive economies. And then the question rises, okay, so what does that mean for the future of growth? And I think we need to end our growth dependency that is deeply written into our economies. So you said you spoke with Nate Hagens before, right? I think Nate is really powerful articulation of the energy pulse that we've been living through. And I think the energy pulse, there's a massive injection of fossil fuels into economies worldwide since like 1900. That is a large explanation for why economies could grow, because there was this huge injection of super cheap energy. And I think we ended up with economies that just grow. And it seems as if, well, of course things grow because this has become the new natural direction. And so the expectation that there will be more growth gets written into the deep designs of our economy. And you just named two of them, the shareholders expecting, right? It's back to this shape I said that keeps me awake at night. It's that one.
No.
Shareholders sleeping at night thinking, when I wake up, it's just going to keep going up. And the shareholder, not just the super wealthy shareholders, but as you said, anyone with a pension plan that's based on stocks and shares, it's got this written into it. So we're all in these and other ways locked into economies that expect, demand, and depend upon continual growth. And the way I try to step back from it, first of all, I try to remind myself that the way that the living world works, this really is real. And this is what we can't redesign. We can't redesign. I mean, we can geoengineer, but that's a very different matter. We can't choose to change the design of the hydrological cycle or the carbon cycle. This is how Earth works. The second law of thermodynamics is real. And this should be at the heart of economics. Things diffuse, things rot, things break down. Nothing lasts forever. Finance and our financial expectation and the idea that finance will give you a rate of return, that is entirely human construct. There's nothing natural or immutable or promised stable about it. It's designed by humans, and we have constructed the world to be in service to that expectation, to the demands of finance. And I try and it's so hard to get because we're so immersed in the world of finance, and many of us are so disconnected from the planet. I really feel often, I'm going to do this with my hands, it's like life versus finance, these very different designs. Finance expects to accumulate. The living world is subject to the second law of thermodynamics. Things dissipate. So they're going in completely opposite directions. Finance does not reflect life at all. And I think of it like this way. If a squirrel collected nuts in the autumn and buried them, that squirrel's not going to come back in January and expect to find 15% more nuts. But we do. We just think it makes sense, that it's normal, that if I put some money, which is a human construct, in a bank, in a stock, that I can come back in some months or some years and there'll be more of it. Nothing else works like that. Yes, if you sow some seeds, there'll be some more, but then they will die. There will be a harvest. It has a cycle. But money has this just endless accumulation. So I think the heart of this, so I don't have the quick solution, like how do we fix this then? But I think we need to start by looking at the places in our economies where we are structurally dependent upon endless growth. Where is this written into the design of our economies? Another one would be that companies are always chasing higher labor productivity. They want to employ fewer people to produce the same amount or produce more stuff with fewer people. Well, if the economy isn't growing, then you're going to get unemployment. and you're going to get an unemployment queue at the office, right? The unemployment office. So that is a very understandable fear for governments, and that's one reason to keep the economy growing. If a government wants more tax revenue to fund public services, it's much easier to grow the economy than to raise the tax rate, right? So you want higher revenue without higher tax rates. And so there's this push for growth. If you know that you have high inequality in your society, the resistance to talking about redistribution because of the power behind that, don't talk about redistribution. Let's just grow the economy and it'll lift all boats. So there are many social and political and financial ways that we're locked in. And actually, for me, one of the really big ones is the international one. So think of the G20 meeting every year. And I think of it as the G20 family photo. You know, you see all the leaders standing in a little line. No political leader wants to lose their nation's place in that photo. But if any one of those countries said, you know what, we're going to move away from a growth-based economy, we're going to learn to thrive instead, then they would be booted out by the next emerging powerhouse. So there is a geopolitical, military interest nations have in continuing to grow because they are, you know, collective action problem. You can't stop growing if the rest are just going to keep going. So there's many ways that we are locked into growth, and making them visible to ourselves is quite overwhelming, actually. But I think it's a real first step, staring it in the face and asking, how can we design away from this? Because I personally cannot see a thriving future in which we do continue to pursue endless growth, because we have not figured out how to decouple economic value creation from energy and material use. They are too tightly coupled, and we are not coming back within planetary boundaries while we could keep pursuing growth. I'm talking about really high income countries here. They're the ones that have the toughest challenge.
Yeah, it seems really overwhelming. I can't think of a better word. You seem to have some optimism. I mean, do you think that regulate from the top down regulation, or do you think that people's voices becoming aware of these issues are enough to steer their economic institutions into something more humane? You seem to have some optimism despite all of this, I suppose, and I'm curious where that springs from.
I don't know if I have optimism.
Uh-oh.
I have an energy, and I have an energy for making visible this other economic world, because I really frustrated that students don't learn about this. I was never taught in my degree, for example, was never invited to ask the question, should economies grow forever? Can economies grow forever? What if they can't? What would happen next? What if it's not desirable? We never asked that question. It was just, well, this will create growth, obviously. Oh yeah, job done. And too many students, their jaws drop today and they realize they've just done 3 years of economics and they've never talked about this. So I am energized by bringing this conversation in. I'm also energized because more and more institutions, from major departments of the UK government to the World Bank to the IMF to the UN, are inviting me and other economists talking about this in to talk. Not writing into the policies yet, but come and give us a lunchtime talk. And lots of people show up, because I think there's a lot of people inside institutions who know this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense, but none of us know how to get out. So there's a lot of interest in hearing these other ways of thinking about the economy. And I'm energized by that, because I know people are alive to the problem.
Yeah, it seems like there's, I'm a real big believer, increasingly so, that a lot of these changes have to come from the ground up. And it seems like there's a cultural element to this, where we've pointed out that people feel addicted to consumption. I've definitely been there myself, for sure. But I wonder what sort of seeds, like people who are just sitting, maybe listening to this podcast, what we can all do to orient ourselves away from that. Like, where do we find that identity in a world that's based on consumption, that has nothing, like, how do we actually escape that? Because I feel like if people did escape it, if we all were able to move away from that mindset more and more, that the changes from the market would respond to that in some sense, which might be naive, but that's what I would hope anyways. And I don't know the answer to that question, it's a very personal thing, obviously, but in a world where we don't really have a celebration of value structures the same way we used to when we had, unified religion. At least our country originally had. Obviously, Europe had this long history of having this unifying religious force, which, came with all of its own problems and so forth. But I feel like as we've moved away from that, it's left this void, right? And people are trying to find meaning and purpose wherever they can, and particularly this concept of identity, like who can I be? And if I can buy my way to that identity, well, that satisfies this deep need for belonging and meaning that maybe I got from going to church on Sunday and submitting myself to some higher authority. But in the absence of that, first of all, I'm not even sure we can get along without something like that. I don't know if religion's the answer, but I'm not sure that we can really orient ourselves towards meaning and purpose without some sort of unified value structure inside of these communities that we live in and inside of the nations that we've built.
Okay, and so I want to add something to that, because I think that you're exactly right. So right now we have the religion becomes progressively less important over the course of the last century. We have, the Nietzschean death of God. In replacement of higher religious structures, we have the market and consumerism, and people start to pay homage to it. And that's from a moral philosophy standpoint, that's probably a dangerous thing to invest yourself into and to serve. And something that I've noticed is that older religions don't seem to have an ecological aspect to them. They're very human centric. And one of the things that I've seen people react to when ecology becomes part of the conversation is this sense that, well, humans are more important than the rest of the things that are on the planet. And they worry that by increasing an ecological awareness, it immediately decreases the value that humans have on the planet because they're not the only dog in town. All of a sudden, there's all of these other things that you have to consider. And so it creates a fracture, because I see a lot of people that are super into ecology and restoration coming up with plans for the future that I feel they kind of freak me out. Like, there was a guy we were watching the other day, he gave a TED Talk where it was very speculative, but he was talking about, one of the best things that we could do for the planet is increasing urban density to an extreme. And so what would it look like if we could fit the entire human population into a single city the size of Texas, and then just allow the rest of the world to grow wild? And on some level, it is an easy solution to the ecological crisis. You concentrate everything, you make it so that the material cycles are closed and basically wall humans off from the rest of the earth. But at the same point, I think that nature and experiences outside and being able to be in the world are really, really important for human health. And so it seems like there's this fracture where, on one hand, people are coming to have a religious, moral relationship with the earth. And the way that they want to deal with that is to remove humans from it as much as possible, as opposed to finding ways to integrate humans into those systems in a way that is holistic and sustainable. And so the question in this is, do you think that it is possible to integrate humans in a holistic and stable way with nature? Or do you lean more towards the sense of take humans out, allow nature to regulate, and hope for the best?
So I was raised without religion, sort of unintentionally by my parents, I think, but so I didn't have that religious upbringing, and I agree that it clearly, in many other people I know who did and do have a religious context in their life, it does bring value and community and many of those things that we seek, which is belonging and ritual and connection and validation and purpose, are indeed served through those communities. I'm now a mother of teenagers who are 15 years old. They haven't gone into the punk phase yet, let alone come out of it. But really aware of, well, what values am I raising my children with? What ritual community am I bringing them into part of being? It's not a religious one, but I'm really aware of that vacuum of clear alternatives, and that we're trying to patch something together. So I strongly agree with you that there is a vacuum in many ways, and people are searching for purpose. And I think consumerism stepped right in. We will help you with this. We will make you feel better when you buy. I think for some people trying to get out of that, there can actually be purpose in the letting go of things. There's a wonderful organization called takethejump.org, which invites us all to follow six transformations you can make in your own lifestyle if you want to live a life that's compatible with keeping global heating within 1.5 degrees. Really massively reducing your flights, not using your private car, eating plant-based diet, things like this. And that actually can, I think, for some people can be a really helpful guidelines towards having a purpose of living well within the planet. Coming to your question about, do I think that the only way to, no, sorry, before I go there, I think in the run up to the climate COP26, which was in Glasgow in the UK, so the climate negotiations, I think it was in 2021, I had a privilege of being part of a dialogue which brought together religious leaders from many, many, many different religious contexts and communities around the world. Jainism and Sikh and Christian and is Jewish and Muslim, just from so many, Confucian, incredible, Buddhist. And they were in conversation about their religion's relation to the living world. And I think what I heard then, of course, they were searching for it and seeking to bring it forth, but it was a beautiful act of, let's bring this forth, because maybe we haven't always talked about this, but actually within the text, there is a connection to the rest of the living world. And I think, the classic one in the Christian tradition of Genesis, does man have dominion over the living world, the rest of nature, or do we have the responsibility of stewardship? And how do you interpret and reinterpret that to get this connection with nature? If to go to your question, Anastasia, about should we all seek to remove people from nature and just stop harming it and all live in a tiny bundle and let nature get on? Of course, there's a completely countervailing story emerging from many indigenous communities saying people can be good for nature. We are part of nature. We can live well with nature. First of all, it's not different from us. Oren Lyons, a faith keeper from the US, one of the First Nations communities in the US, he spoke at I think it was California's College of Natural Resources. And he said, what you people call your natural resources, we call our relatives. You need to get back to the relationship. This is going to be the foundation for your survival if you recognize that we are related to all these other living beings. It's not humans and the rest, but also that we are in a relation of stewardship with them. And many indigenous societies will say, look, actually where we live, there's greater biodiversity. I think the statistics that people are often citing today is indigenous people constitute around 6% of the world population, but they live in regions that host 80% of the world's biodiversity, because the way that they live in relation, in a web, in an interdependence, means that they actually cultivate the biodiversity. So you wouldn't want to just take those people out. And that's, in fact, of course, the worst of the history of conservation movements is there's people in the forest, get the people out of the forest. Actually, those people are tending the forest. They are part of that system. So don't try and pull them out. So I wouldn't say pull everybody into cities, but what we do need to do is transform the way we live in cities, but also the way we live and practice agriculture and live rurally. We've inherited degenerative industrial systems, degenerative agricultural industry, degenerative urban industry, where we've seen Earth's materials as materials there for man, like Lego blocks for us to take, and we make stuff and we use it often only once and then we throw it away. So we have this linear degenerative industrial system that we've inherited from the last century that CEOs made billions on. They made wonderful stock returns for their shareholders, and they were delivered wonderful returns into people's pension plans. But it's industry that's been running down the living world, and it runs down only in one direction. And we are literally devouring the sources of our own sustenance. So we need to redesign, whether we are living within nature and rurally or in cities, we need to redesign our economy so that they are regenerative, so that we use resources again and again. We recognize the value of every resource. There's no such thing as a waste. It's just a material in the wrong place. There's no such thing as throwing it away. There is no away. And to me, this is not fundamentally an economic question. It actually comes down to material design. And there's young material designers coming out of college and university saying, we can design plastics that biodegrade. We can design materials that will work. That we can do this materially.
Regenerative farming, right? From a from an empowering perspective to the consumer, we actually do have a lot of votes with our dollars, right? So if you do have the income to be able to afford it, you can actually invest by what you purchase, right? You can buy food from regenerative farms. If you just take it from a ground up market-based perspective, there is a lot of work you can do in terms of putting your money into these practices that you think will actually make for a better world for your kids, for your grandkids, for people down the line, for yourself ultimately. And honestly, the products that you get from those systems are I believe they're much healthier, more nutritious, and ultimately better for everybody. I think that I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just the indigenous communities. There's a lot of people really in the developed world who are working in small scale on a lot of these more sustainable practices from really good companies that are manufacturing in the United States. It might cost you more to get your boots from them or something, but they're doing it cleaner. They're doing a better job. They're giving people work here. There's a lot of ways to support this movement just in terms of where you go to buy your jeans, or where you go to buy or where you get your food from. So there is an aspect that we can take into our own hands about this. I feel like when you start talking about, trying to limit plane travel or something like that, it kind of gets beyond a lot of people. I think that seems really freaky, And when it comes to those big impact processes like transportation, that's, I feel like, where we can really push our municipal systems to adapt. Because I look at just the ridiculous overuse of cars in our own country. I mean, it's preposterous. We live on the West Coast. You cannot get from our town directly down to San Francisco, which is like the biggest, or Portland, which are the two biggest cities, right? I mean, there's a huge highway system. There's cars going everywhere. And then once you get to San Francisco, there is a sort of middling public transportation system that's not been doing, it's been declining, let's say, in its efficacy. But you go to the suburbs and so forth, and everybody's just gridlocked in their Teslas or whatever. And it's sad because you look at these boulevards and you think, man, you could just have a tram going down this right? If I want to go to Whole Foods, I should be able to just jump on a light rail, go down there. But instead, you just got these suburbs that are just crammed with cars. And it just seems like that's the situation where we could really look to our municipal systems and push them to really make these changes happen. And I know there's a lot of interests fighting back against that, right? The automobile industry in our country seems, I don't know the full story, but everybody kind of points at it as, well, it's impossible to get anything done because of that. That's why we have all these freeways and everything. But I don't know, it just seems like there's different tiers by which top-down regulation could make a huge impact, and also where we can make a huge impact just in our own little tiny lives as well.
Yes. I'm struck that you say people think it's a bit freak or something if you say, it's got to fly a lot less. I mean, I think we all have to fly a lot less. I've stopped flying. I mean, I'm not saying I will never get on a plane again, but I don't fly. I'm really waiting to see if there's an occasion that would make me say, now that really is worth getting on a plane. I recognize I'm in Europe, although I'm Brexit edge of Europe. So we have to go on a train under the sea to get into mainland Europe. But once you're, for example, just to contrast,
Europe's
the
way
really
better.
frustrating
Yeah.
system you describe. Yeah, I mean, the train connections within Europe are phenomenal. And again, it's about, so let's go right back to where we began. Free markets, let them rip. They will give you suburban sprawl, every man a car and every household a car, because that is what's going to keep the market pumping for gasoline and for cars. And you get this ridiculous gridlock. You need state-led public good provision. I mean, what you could do, and you're locked into your highway system, right? Because the sprawl of urban design was permitted. But what you could do is have a regulation that says, right, we're just going to take one lane of every highway. We're just totally commandeering that lane. And this is going to be electric buses just going up and down all the time. So it'll be cheaper, so much quicker, so much more pleasant. You can read a book, get some work done. What's not to like? Why would you own your car? And you can design it that way. City of Curitiba in Brazil was the pioneer of these kind of dedicated lane bus routes for people traveling long distances. So we can do that even with the infrastructures that we've inherited. But yes, I totally agree. If you look at the city of Barcelona in Spain, I mean, they've just done phenomenal things. They had kind of gridlock they have a very kind of grid-based city. Well, if you look at it from above, it looks like a chessboard of squares of blocks. They've just removed cars from major intersections, put in a public park. So they're literally turning private kind of space held by private cars occupying public space and producing a lot of pollution into the commons. They're putting the commons back in where people can connect and create community. And it might not be a church, but it's a playground. And we build community and we start to know each other and we start to feel like we belong here and we're proud of our neighborhood and the air is clean and it's cool on a hot day because there's trees. And again, and there's not a lot of money changing hands there. It's people having a snack, playing with the kids in the park after school. It's not boosting GDP, but my goodness, it's boosting well-being. And it's making people say, this is a great place to live. So again, it's when we move away from those growth-centered metrics. And Barcelona is a city, I'd say, that's really, they're using the donut. They're one of 80 cities or towns or districts or counties worldwide that have adopted the framework of donut economics to say this really stands for and symbolizes the transformation that we want to make here. And we're going to measure our local place against whether or not we're meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And so when I've been to Barcelona, I'm just blown away by the transformation that they're just driving through. Wrong metaphor. They're just making happen in that city. Goodbye, car. You were very useful in the 20th century. We now know far too much about the challenges you create socially and ecologically and health-wise. We're just removing the car. We're bringing back light rail, trams, walking, talking, and you get.
Is that by popular
back.
Demand?
Yes, there is popular demand. I mean, actually,
like, did that arise by popular demand, or was that a policy? Was that some politician-driven thing?
When I was in Barcelona, I've been walked around by one of the city architects who was in charge of this scheme, and I said, "How did it begin?" And they said, "Well, actually, what we did on the first time, we blocked it out overnight. We rolled in car tires." And we put them down so that they blocked out the cars. We sort of modeled it up, mocked it up overnight. And now some people were very angry about it, understandably, right? What the heck? I used to be able to drive to work this way. And now I can't. I've got to go all the way around. But they said we started that way and it caused a lot of discussion. But then nobody wanted it. Well, the majority of people did not want it to be taken away once they saw what could emerge. Right? It's all a classic vested interest. You're very aware of who's losing, but we don't yet know who's going to gain because they haven't been mobilized. They haven't built their networks, communities. So when they were going to take it away, and then the architect, she went on to say, but I mean, of course, we shouldn't have begun like that. We should have begun with a sort of more deliberative conversation. I said, but do you really think it would have happened? And she said, no, you're right. Actually, sometimes you need that guerrilla action. You need to disrupt and say, look at this possibility. Yes, we didn't ask for permission, right? But we are asking forgiveness. Look what you see here. Now, do you want it back in? And having disrupted it first, now it's spread from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood. And of course, there are people who are frustrated by it. I can't get my car through anymore. But there are many people who say, wow, my kids can walk home and play after school. And the health and the quality of the air and the quality of life. So it's really shifting over.
Have you ever read The Power Broker?
No.
So there was a guy named Robert Moses who was in charge of the New York City Parks Department in the 30s, right? And so The Power Broker is a biography of Robert Moses by Robert Caro, and it's a hefty tome, but it was really, really interesting to me how over the course of this, almost, I think, 40-year career as the dawn of the Parks Department, Moses transformed the city. He built the highways. And he accomplished that exactly the way that you're saying. It was never by committee. It was never by discussion. It was the fact that Moses had a vision, Moses had the power, and Moses just did it. And he was beloved by drivers because he put these freeways in and allowed them to be able to tool around. His entire thing was that driving should be a pleasurable experience, and so he built all these parkways that were very beautiful. He built massive monuments to the car. And he obviously changed the course of urban development around the world, because I think that he was being commissioned by governments all over the world to design their highway systems. And so his stamp is on most countries in the world that have a highway system. And it's an interesting paradox, because I feel like the people who are interested in reviving urban spaces and creating these new policies are often reluctant to simply do without committee, because there's a certain political leaning that suggests that, well, the democratic process is the right process by which to do these things. And Moses's great fault was that he didn't do that. He just did. He had a vision and he implemented it, and come what may. And I don't know exactly how I feel about that, because on one hand, I wouldn't want someone deciding for me the way that my city is going to look. But on the other hand, I also recognize that there are changes that have to be made that by consensus cannot necessarily be achieved. And so there does seem to be this need for someone to step in and say, you know what, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to do it, and we're going to try it, and we're going to see what happens. And that seems to be a big... So we live in an area that's very conservative. Super, super red. There's Trump signs in many of the lawns, which at this point to me is astounding, because having this, billionaire tycoon be the voice of the hardcore working class is like very, very strange to me.
Yeah.
But there's a sense among these people that I meet that they're worried that someone is going to make decisions that disempower them to continue to live the life that they lead. And so it creates this massive fracture point where, even in that discussion where we were, I was listening that you moderated between the degrowth and the green growth guys at Oxford, it was this sense where, well, we don't have time for consensus. We just have to act. And I'm like, is that not going to feed increased polarization and dissatisfaction and create these spark points among these strongly opposed groups about the vision of what the future will look like? It's like, you're going to take my truck away. You're going to take my flights away. You're going to take my cows away.
So just going back to Robert Moses, I've seen some fascinating documentaries about his work, and you said he sort of built a sort of homage to the car. One thing I remember, he also built bridges that were extremely low so that only a single car could go through and a bus couldn't go through, which would mean it would keep out the low-income communities who could only travel by bus. Right. So beautiful example, a powerful example of exclusionary design, right? Divisive by design, literally through the infrastructure that's made. And of course, it took Jane Jacobs and mothers with prams marching to protect, where is it? Is it Union Street Square? I can't remember, downtown Manhattan, when he was going to go through this beloved square. And it was then, so that's sort of the power of the market for the car. And then it was then when the people, the commons, the householders, actually the mothers, literally with their prams, and it's sort of a very powerful reflection of what's now emerged in Barcelona, we demand to protect this public space. This is where we meet. And we, these aren't the words that they were using, but the way I see it is kind of thinking it through kind of economics. This may not show up in your GDP, but the value of us as families, as parents, connecting as community, this is the commons. and you're about to destroy the commons and put a run through for the car and the private sale of vehicles and fossil fuels for the convenience of the individual. And they defended that and protected that. And I think Jane Jacobs, we need eyes on the street. This is community that makes a place. Her work versus Robert Moses was so iconic of these very different worldviews being played out in the landscape of a city. Then you were talking about, do we just need to impose these solutions? So I said, in Barcelona, I was told it began as a sort of guerrilla moment. Let's just try this. Now, I think if the majority of people had really not liked it, it would not have gone, because ultimately it's city councillors who need to pass these things through. I live in Oxford, in a place called East Oxford, where the city council have recently put in bollards that stop cars from driving, using it as a rat run, driving across, so that the streets are much quieter. It's much safer for kids to bike. It's much more of a neighborhood. Some people are very, very angry about it. And there are different views about this. But, the councillors who've done this, we've just had a local election. And actually here, the councillors who did this got re-elected in most, but not all places. So if you're in politics, of course you need consensus if you want to get re-elected. What I think is the really interesting move that is being recommended in many places, and I'm a supporter of it, but I'm worried it could get captured itself, is the rise of citizens' assemblies. So many people will say, for example, let me give you an example. The city of Amsterdam, in their circularity policy and sustainability, they adopted donut economics as the vision of what Amsterdam was aiming to do. And the vice mayor of sustainability in Amsterdam, she said, right, we're going to draw up a carbon policy here in Amsterdam. I need to create a citizens' assembly because I want people who don't depend upon getting re-elected to listen to all the evidence and actually come up with a long-term vision. We need to free this from those who are in the cycles of election. We need to give it to people who can take a longer view. In Japan, they have a wonderful thing that's kind of future design, where they bring together citizens. They put on a beautiful kimono. There's a town called Yahaba in Japan. They have this beautiful yellow kimono that you put on. And when you're wearing the kimono of Yahaba, you are a citizen of Yahaba from 60 years in the future. And we want you to engage in this conversation from 60 years in the future. And people make different decisions. They make longer term decisions. So can we use citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy to bring together voices of people who have very different opinions, free them from the need to get re-elected, listen to multiple views? The evidence that I've heard of shows that they come up with much more ambitious, long-term, ecological, well-being oriented policies than do elected politicians. So I'm really interested, if we need consensus, and if it's not going to be through voting, the rise of the Citizens' Assembly as a potential place. Before I stop, I do want to say I worry that if they become popular and they start to become used, then the lobbyists will come chasing after them in the same way that they do in trials, Trump trial, disqualifying jurors, who's going to be a witness. So there's a risk that citizens' assemblies could likewise get gamed. Who's on the assembly? Who gets to be an expert? In what order will the experts speak? So everything can be gamed. I don't want to be idealistic about citizens' assemblies, but I think it's a really interesting innovation in re-enriching democracy in a deliberative way, turning it away from this kind of once every 4 years in a ballot box, but deepening the local conversation for local transformations. And all the, like I said, 80 cities and communities around the world, local governments are using donut economics as a tool of transformation in their locality. And of course, this generates strong local civic debate, because using the donut doesn't give you the answers. It makes visible the many dilemmas and the challenges and a bigger long-term vision, but it doesn't give you the answers. It gives you a better basis for having a more nuanced and hopefully empathic conversation.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the practical applications that you've been working on, because you said that was kind of what you were focused on most right now.
Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by people who say, despite the structures of the world, despite the direction of financial return, degenerative design, despite all the institutions and power relations that we find ourselves immersed in, I want to start making change happen. Some of the companies that you mentioned, Shilo, the kinds of companies that say, well, we're just going to do this differently. We're going to be different kinds of businesses. Some of the towns and cities like Barcelona, we're just going to change this design. We're going to reverse what the 20th century told us was right and normal. Some of the educators and some communities. So briefly. So starting with education, right? It was teachers who first wrote to me and said, I am teaching the donut and its concepts in my classroom. It's not on the syllabus, but this is what my students should learn. And we work with teachers worldwide who want to put these ideas into practice. We're working with them so they can just teach it directly in the classroom, from kindergarten to high school to university, but also working with those who are trying to change the curriculum so it gets written into the curriculum. And it already is in some curricula, the International Baccalaureate, for example. It's already in the textbook. And that means teachers have then permission to teach it. So working with an international movement of students called Rethinking Economics, there are economic students worldwide who signed up and are paying large debts to study economics at university, and they get there and they realize that they're being taught a mindset that's out of date. And so the first thing they end up doing is lobbying to transform the curriculum. We're working with them to bring the ideas of donut economics into their curriculum. So a lot going on in education. Community groups worldwide, from California, the California Donut Economics Coalition, to in Malaysia, in Spain, all around the world, in Brazil, in Mexico, in the UK, in Europe. There are community organizations that have sprung up and said, we want to use this as a tool for local transformation, a bit like transition towns. We're going to see what would it mean. We want to inspire people and bring other people into the economic conversation. You know, a lot of people are afraid of economics. It's quite intimidating. And often people would say to me, oh, you do economics. I'm not very good at maths. I'd say, you know, in my book, the only numbers are the page numbers. We can all do this. And actually it repoliticizes economics, and everybody realizes they should be part of that conversation. So community groups too. But just to bring it in, I've been talking already about some of the towns and cities, the local councillors or mayors who say, you know, unlike national governments that are locked into growth to stay in the picture, to stay in the competition, towns and cities don't have that same drive. They want to be places where people choose to live because they thrive there. And so it actually is much more aligned with what living well within the means of the planet, healthy nature, healthy people, smart public transport, well-being in the commons and community over domination by the market. Let's create those places. And some of the smaller towns and cities in the world, and some big ones, are now saying this is actually what we want to be proud of being. So we're really fascinated working with local government, who are then turning it into a tool for decision making in government. Can we now make decisions differently, allocate budget differently, say yes or no on an investment, on whether or not it meets the needs of all within the means of the planet? But then also I want to end up with business, because we've touched on it a few times. Many companies, ever since I first published The Donut back in 2012, have got in touch and said, oh, we're a different kind of company. In fact, that could almost be our logo. We exist to create clean water. We exist to produce healthy food, or make vegan boots, or create regenerative clothing. And we say, look, let's have a conversation. We would love to build a community of companies that are doing this, but we don't just want to talk about the design of your products, because we think actually what really matters is the design of the company itself. And there are 5 design traits we always talk to about companies. And I invite anybody listening to think about a company you work for, or one you love or hate, or you founded or you've left, and think about its deep design. Because when we understand the deep design of a company, we can really understand whether or not it can be part of the transformation we need in the world. So it's deep design. First of all, what is the purpose of this company? Why does it even exist? What is it in service of in the world? What are its networks of relationship with its employees, with its customers, its suppliers, its industry allies? Is it very competitive and extractive, or actually is it living out its stated values in those relationships? How is it governed? Who's in the room when decisions are made? And what are the criteria, the metrics of decision making? Do workers have a voice on the board? Does nature have a voice on the board? There's a shampoo company called Faith in Nature that was always asking itself, what would nature want us to do? And they said, let's actually make that official. They've now got an environmental lawyer representing nature on the board as one of 11 directors, making decisions on behalf of nature. What about if you have future generations on the board? So extend the stakeholders who have a legal decision-making power in the company. And as we go deeper down this, it gets deeper. It gets, like, I call it corporate psychotherapy, right? The most powerful things lie deepest. So ownership. How is this company owned? Is it owned by shareholders, by a family for 300 years? Is it owned by venture capitalists, by its employees, by the state? All of these are prevailing designs of business, and they have huge implications for what sits at the bottom, which is, how is this company financed? Where's the money that makes this company run coming from? Is it coming from sales? Is it coming from share issue? Is it coming from venture capital? Is it coming from family wealth? Because where it's coming from will deeply determine what that finance, that human construct that we call finance, here it is, what that finance expects, what it demands, and what it extracts. Does it expect 15% year on year? Or does it say, actually, we're really here because of the purpose. We're investing in this purpose. That's why this business exists. I want a fair return, but it can be 5% or 3%. Why does it have to be 15%? Why do we have the structure between here, the ownership, governance, and finance that maximizes return to the investors and the owners of the company? That is one quite odd design of what a company should be about. So when we work with companies, we talk to them precisely at this level of the deep design of your business. And how could you change the deep design so that you actually can be far more regenerative, far more distributive of the value that you create? And it's a fascinating journey. Of course, many companies don't go near that because they're very stuck in shareholder-led value creation, maximizing returns. But many other companies and many young entrepreneurs actually who are starting up companies to produce clothing or food or energy differently, they're really smart about the design of their product. And then they realize, I want to be equally smart about the design of my company because I don't want it to be, I don't want venture capital to come in and just rub off the ambition of my edges because it wants its return. I don't want it to have a takeover bid that just says, your purpose was a really nice marketing brand and now we're just going to go mainstream with you. I want to lock in my purpose. So that's a fascinating conversation we're having with business as well.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, I had a thought during the break. We didn't really unpack the airplane travel thing as much as I was hoping to because, you mentioned that you try to cut down on your flights. I don't like flying just because I hate flying. It's just a nightmare and getting stuck in the airport all day. And I'd rather just, see the countryside if possible. But I had a suspicion in the break that I wonder how much of the air traffic is really commercial flights, like people like you and me flying around. And at least in our country, it seems like it's not the majority of the flights. In fact, it's not even close to the majority. Most of the flights in our country are private planes or taxi planes, so private planes for hire, with a really small portion devoted to military and transport, actually, which surprised me. And so it's kind of reminds me a little bit of the car problem in the same way that you have a lot of people with these individual cars or these individual vehicles flying around in this case that are actually racking up all of their air miles, whereas if you can think of commercial flight as public transport, at least you get a lot of people in one plane. That actually makes up somewhere on the order of a third of the flights in our country every day. It's actually quite a small minority. And I wonder if that...
It's interesting because I'm looking at the same data and it's like, it looks like half is, like if you look at the commercial flights, so there's 28,000 commercial flights and then there's 27 general aviation flights, but these are private planes.
Right.
These are just people flying around.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
And so that's 50%.
Well, just private planes and private planes for hire essentially make up more than half for sure.
Yes,
of
I mean,
usage.
like only 7% is cargo. There's a small number of military flights and cargo flights. So it's like upwards of 90% of the flights are people just flying around.
But do you see what I'm saying? I think
Not
you
yet.
missed my point. My point is it's not people cramming into American Airlines or something. It's people who own jets or are hiring them for their personal business or whatever. It's much like people owning their own cars as opposed to taking a bus.
I see.
I'm like, hey, I actually think people flying on these big commercial flights is good. Because the alternative is people flying their own planes around, which is bad.
I see.
Although, yeah, I mean, I think they're both an issue. So the private jets is, of course, the super wealthy and often the corporate. And of course, business class and first class are often corporate, right? So there's business that's flying its people around the world. Oh, I have a meeting. We have to meet. And I just think...
And that's the super majority of flights. That's what's shocking to me, I guess.
Is it? I don't know.
I mean, at least I'm just looking at the National Air Traffic Controllers Administration statement. This is obviously just for our country, but they say there's 87,000 flights in the United States every day. And only 28,000 are commercial, but 27,000 are private planes and 25,000 are planes for hire. And so right away, there's this huge chunk of air traffic that isn't normal people like you and me flying around. It's something else, and I feel like that just doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But
That's a good
Absolutely.
Point. That's a good
And
point.
actually, in sort of the degrowth movement, would one of their top recommendations, people say, okay, what kind of policies? They say, well, just ban private jets.
yeah,
I mean,
that would
we don't
that
have
would
private trains
that
going
would
up and
solve your
down the train
problem. Yeah,
railways.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just reminds me
Ban
so
private
much
jets.
of the car problem too in our country. Anyways,
Yes.
it's like, yeah, you want to get more people in a car. Ideally, that's a train, right? Because that's probably the most efficient way to transport people.
Yeah.
And I feel like the same. I mean, people aren't going to stop. Like, if you need to go to Europe, you're not going to probably swim there. You're going to take a plane. But there's probably a better way. There's better ways of doing that.
I mean, I have a vision
are.
for the future of the world that isn't locking people into the places where they are. I mean, I love. I
That's
grew
what
up.
I'm trying to get at, I think.
Yeah, like I grew up in a family that was a nomadic family. So I was born in Russia, then we moved to Israel, then we moved to Canada, then we moved to the United States. And one of the values that my parents instilled in me really early on was the importance of travel, because they grew up in this place where they were completely locked into the small world in which they were born. And so for them, it was the highest value to expose their children to what the world actually looked like and to be able to experience directly what that meant required taking flights, because we were in California, and so we had to take flights. And I feel like I gained an immense amount of value from that experience, but something that really I've been introduced to by Shilo is that he really doesn't like to fly. Like hardcore, I've never seen anybody who dislikes flying as much as Shilo. At some point when we were in grad school, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, he watched every single air accident that had ever happened. And so had really cemented his distaste for
It's
the
not
experience.
even that. It's just the airports and the waiting and getting stuck and crammed in increasingly tinier seats, and the whole thing's just miserable for me.
But I imagine a future where, when we were 100 years ago, people were talking about fears of overpopulation and mass starvation. What happened is that there was a technological breakthrough that allowed us to fix nitrogen from the air. We created fertilizer, we created new breeds of plants, and so we had the Green Revolution, and we averted starvation. And so if this thing that everybody was afraid of was averted by virtue of technological change. And it wasn't that we got rid of people, it's that we met the needs of the people through these novel technologies. And I think that travel is one of those things that in the future, I imagine a way for people to be able to travel because of technological improvements that doesn't destroy the world as you do it. And that probably means slower travel, right? Maybe it means taking a boat that's wind powered as opposed to taking a flight. And maybe that means that you have to take a week to get there instead of being able to get there in 4 hours. But the journey becomes the part of it that is important. And in order for that to be possible...
I like Mosler's solution that we just have worldwide 30-mile-an-hour speed limits. He's like, that will solve the emissions problem overnight. Nobody will want to use their cars anymore.
Very good.
And
I really appreciate the value of flying. I know that when I was actually as a kid, we used to go on holiday to France on the ferry, but in the early parts of my career, I worked for the UN. I flew to conferences, and I just didn't register. But now I really realize that, yes, it's wonderful to fly. And my own kids, I would love them to see the world, but we go by train and it costs more and it definitely takes a lot longer. But then when I look at the carbon emissions of people who live in the global north compared to people in the rest of the world, I just personally, coming back to the moral philosophy, I can't justify why I should have the right to use more of that carbon. I do hope there are breakthrough technologies, but we haven't got them yet. And so I think, I'm going to be bold, I think we all do need to fly a lot less. Like today, before talking to you, by email, I turned down giving really interesting talks in Chile, one in Mexico City, one in Copenhagen, because I would have had to fly there and back. I could have gone to Copenhagen on the train, but I judged, a bit like the 30-mile-an-hour thing. Actually, for that one meeting, it's not worth me traveling 2 days there and 2 days back. I went to Stockholm by train, last October because it was really good and I packed in lots of things. I'm going to Ireland in September. It would probably take me, I don't know, an hour's flight or something less. I don't know. But I'm not going to fly because I can't legitimate for myself to get on a plane to go to a university in Dublin to talk about sustainability. I just can't do it. So it means I fly a lot less. But actually, and yet my job is communication. It is ideas, and turning up and being there in person, I know is a really powerful way of doing it. And I've had this conversation with Nate Hagans, and we've just taken different choices. And he'd say, look, I need to do this flying to communicate. I feel like that is a really effective thing to do. And I've just made a different decision. I'm going to see how much I can do by not flying. I'm going to try and be compelling on screen. I'm going to do podcasts. I'm going to talk to people online. I won't fly to your conference, but I will join online if you'll have me. And I promise you, actually, my favorite thing is if people think I was in the room. Some people in Melbourne once said, you know, that time you were in Melbourne? I was like, no, I've never been to Melbourne. No, you were here for our conference. I wasn't there. I was online. I'm so pleased you thought I was there, because that's the connection we're looking for. So it's never the same. But as a parent as well, I want to be around for my kids. I don't want to say, oh, mum, you were just flying somewhere, you know. So it connects for me. I'm trying to, I eat a meat-free diet. I've actually enjoyed doing the Take the Jump, and like, this is hard, but actually also there's new liberation coming from it. And we gave up owning a car. I live in a city where that is possible, and I can rent a car through a car scheme. So I'm also aware I've got the privilege of being in places where substitutes are available if I need one, but I bike most places. So it's that I'm just always trying to push myself. What's the next thing out of my comfort zone that I can do? And of course, there are places I wish I could be, events that I wish I could have gone to, but I can't justify how somebody like me, who's already used way more than my fair share of the world's carbon budget, to keep flying. I've stopped. And I think many, many more of us need to, or at least not stop entirely, but really ask, do I have to fly home for Thanksgiving? Do I then fly back again? Do I always go back for my cousin's wedding? Do I have to take a holiday abroad? Do I really? 100 years ago, 50 years ago, nobody imagined doing this. It's a very quickly learned norm that we just think is normal and all right. And I just think we need to unlearn it, because we don't have the claim on that carbon budget, and the planet can't afford it. And if billions of people now in the global south, that they get rising incomes, they say, well, that's the lifestyle. America and Europe have taught us that's the lifestyle. Then we're really in stuck.
I think that is a really beautiful way of looking at the world, which is that you look at your own life and you look to see what it's possible to give up and what it is possible to change and shift. Because Shilo's been driving at this, I feel like, for the entire conversation, which is that this begins on a personal level. Zara will keep making clothes every single week if you come in every single week and keep buying the clothes. There will continue to be private jets if there are people who are buying the flights. There will continue to be, massive gas guzzling cars that are produced as long as people keep buying them. And these are choices that in large form have alternatives.
And the alternatives can be quite pleasurable too. Like I've been wearing this same blazer for 15 years, and it's nice because I don't have to think about like, oh geez, what blazer am I going to wear for this podcast or whatever, right? I think there's something really nice about removing yourself from that mess to as much as possible, you know? I mean, yeah, you have to invest in good products up front, but like you don't have to be completely chasing that thing all the time, right? And so I think you can find, and anyways, I just wanted to say, I really appreciate you putting your money where your mouth is. I think that really supports the rhetoric that you're putting forward in a way that a lot of people, the hypocrisy really gets in the way for people hearing these messages, I think oftentimes. So
yes, it can do. Yeah, it can do.
Anyways,
and I think it's true. I mean, there's always the debate about, is it, up to the individual, or actually, no, it's the opposite. It's not up to individuals. Some people would argue the opposite, right? They say, no, it's not up to individuals because that's corporations making us feel guilty and that we are the ones who must make the right choice and they're not changing. So actually, I'm not going to change. I need the system to change. I would never come down on one side or the other. I mean, individuals obviously drive change, right? I enjoy going into a restaurant and saying, I'm vegan. What can you give me? And there's nothing on the menu. But of course they can create something, and a message goes into the kitchen. There's a vegan, there's another vegan, there's another. Finally, there will be something on the menu, and then somebody who isn't even vegan will try it. And there's been a boom in vegan meals, certainly in the UK. It's like, oh, now it's getting really hard because you actually have to choose. It used to be a bit like your blazer. I'll just have that one. It's the only one on the menu. Now I have to make choices. But I really enjoy helping open up those new spaces. So I enjoy taking individual action. And I massively believe we need systemic change. And it's never going to happen if we're waiting for everyone to go vegan and everyone to stop flying and everyone to keep wearing the same blazer, because that ain't going to happen. We need structural change. So I enjoy working on both because I've got very strong control over what I do and don't purchase and do. And I can feel a very strong sense of agency and autonomy there. And I've got very little control over what the companies do, but I can engage in collective action. And this kind of work of exposing the deep design of companies and challenge companies, you are deeply designed to keep selling me stuff. And until you change your deep design, I ain't going to buy that you're becoming regenerative and sustainable, because you are deeply designed not to do that. So I think it's a real balance of both of them, that we need them together. They're going to work best when they work together.
That's right.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you for giving us as much time as you have. And it's been, this has been really enlightening, and it's given me a lot of hope too about a lot of these topics, because they're often very difficult conversations. There's so many conflicting interests and so forth, but I feel like regardless of what you think, you have a lot of optimism about the situation, and
thank you.
I really appreciate it.
You give off a
real
lot
pleasure
of
talking with
optimism.
you both, actually. Real pleasure talking with you. I really love the conversational style. I really love the questions going around. You've made me say things I've never said before on a podcast or in general, which of course is the art of a great conversation. And if anybody listening is like, well, I want to know more about this donut economics thing, or could I get involved? Or she mentioned a California Donut Coalition, or where anybody is welcome to become a member of our community. There's now over 12,000 people. You just go to donuteconomics.org. You can join, you can scroll. Everything that we produce, we put in the commons, because we believe in the commons. So all the materials for teachers, all the business workshops, all the community workshops, it's all there in the commons. Anyone can take it and use it in your own company, in your own community, in your own school. Because that's the way we think the ideas will spread at the speed and scale these times require. So thank you very much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you
Nice.
so much.
Yeah, we'll link that. We'll link your website in the description.
Lovely. Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.